I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to the 7th chapter of the Openstax Psychology textbook. Today we'll be discussing thinking and intelligence, and so we'll ask questions like, what is cognition? And discuss language, problem solving, intelligence and creativity, how we measure intelligence, and the sources of it. Cognition is basically thinking. And cognitive psychology is the field of psychology dedicated to examining how people think. It attempts to explain how and why we think the way we do by studying the interactions among human thinking, emotion, creativity, language, and problem solving. So let's start with concepts. Now, concepts are categories or groupings of linguistic information, images, ideas, or memory of such things like life experiences. They're big ideas that are generated by observing details. Now, concepts can be very broad, like world history, or very personal, like your family's birthday traditions. Similarly, they can be abstract, like justice, or concrete, like types of birds, or really, like types of concrete. A prototype is the best example or representation of a particular concept. So a sparrow is a prototypical bird, whereas an ostrich is not. Natural concepts are created naturally through your experiences and can be developed from either direct or indirect experiences. So it doesn't really matter if you grew up somewhere where there's a lot of snow or if you've only seen it on television and in movies, you have a natural concept of what snow is. Artificial concepts are ones that are defined by a specific set of characteristics. So for example, a triangle has 3 sides and 3 angles. A square has 3 equal sides, actually it's 4 equal sides and 4 right angles. And things like mathematical equations are the same way. They're artificial concepts. A schema is a mental construct consisting of a cluster or a collection of related concepts. So schemata are methods of organizing information that allows the brain to work more efficiently. And there are several different types of schemata. And so we have role schemas, and that makes assumptions about how individuals in certain roles will behave. So for example, we have a role schema for a firefighter. And so if you find out that someone you know is a firefighter, it activates the firefighter schema, and you begin making assumptions about the person, like that they're brave, they're selfless, and they probably enjoy eating chili. An event schema or cognitive script is a set of behaviors that can feel like a routine, and they tend to vary by culture. So we have a script for a fast food restaurant, but we also have one for fine dining. So if you sat down in a McDonald's and waited for a waiter to come over or a waitress to take your order, you'd be sitting there for a long time. Whereas if you went to a fine restaurant and you walked to a counter and gave them your order, they would wonder what in the world's going on. Language is a communication system that uses words and semantic rules to actually it should be syntactic rules to transmit information from one individual to another. The components of language are lexicon, which are the words or vocabulary of a given language, and grammar, which is the set of rules used to convey meaning. A phoneme is the basic sound of a given language, and different languages have different phonemes. So English has 26 letters, but 44 different phonemes. A morpheme is the smallest unit of language that conveys some type of meaning. So I is both a phoneme and a morpheme. And let's remember, there's no I in team. The components of language are semantics and syntax. Semantics are all about meaning. It's the process by which we derive meaning from morphemes and words. And syntax is essentially the way that words are organized into sentences. It's the rules that they have to follow. And semantics and syntax are both used to construct language. Well, where does it come from? Well, B.F. Skinner believed that language was learned through reinforcement. Noam Chomsky said, no, that's not correct. And he's generally believed to be, Chomsky is considered to be correct. That language is biologically determined. We have a biological predisposition to learn language and a critical period for when it has to occur. Now, newborns have a preference for their mother's voice. Oh, and that's Noam Chomsky off to the right. I should point that out too. Newborns have a preference for their mother's voice and for videos where language and faces move in sync. And that makes some sense. By the time somebody's 1 year old, they're only able to discriminate among phonemes that are used in their language, in their environment, the way the people used by people that they're around. The babbling stage occurs during the first few months, and children aren't trying to communicate, they're just literally babbling. And we also find that children raised in environments that use sign language show babbling in their gestures with their hands, so they're also babbling. First words usually occur between 12 and 18 months, but there's variability with this too. One of my 3 children, he only said nah until he was 2. And I mean, for anything, do you want some more of this? Nah. Do you want to go outside? Nah. All he would say was nah. He's a straight A student in college. He had a 31 ACT. These are not things that, children vary. I guess that's my point. Overgeneralization, this is something that children do too. This is the extension of a language rule to an exception to the rule. And so, for example, in past forms of verbs usually use ed. So you work, but you worked. So there's an ed at the end. Children overgeneralize this, though, and so they might say, I go to school. And instead of saying I went to school, they say I goed to school. And so you find something similar to this with plurals, too. You can ask children about, they learn the rule that they have to apply an S to it. What about language and thought? Well, Sapir and Whorf come up with a theory that language determines thought, that if a language doesn't have terms for something, then people can't think about it. And so the Hopi language didn't have terms for the past. And so they said, well, those people can't, Hopi people can't think about the past. I do this as a classroom exercise all the time, is I go through and have everybody give a slang term for money, and you have 30 people in a class and they can all come up with a different term. It's pretty amazing. And so this would argue that language at least influences the way we thought. So they can look at different languages with this too. So in English, we see time as being horizontal, that I'm running behind schedule. Or you might say time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. And that's an old Groucho Marx joke. In Mandarin Chinese, though, they may see time as being vertical, so that the past is up and the future is down. Another example of this is the Danai, and it's a tribe in Indonesia. They have 2 words for color, light and dark, but they can still distinguish colors with the same ability as English speakers. Now, your book says that English has 11 words for color, but apparently they've never been to a paint store. Try going to a paint store and saying you want to paint your walls white. There's almost an infinite variety of variations on white. My old house, it was out in the country, and so I painted it country white so I could remember what it was. And I have a newer house, and it's summer white, and I remember that because I painted it during the summer. A problem-solving strategy is a plan of action used to find a solution to a problem. Trial and error is when you continue to try different solutions to solve a problem. It's not time efficient, but it is commonly used. Now, an algorithm is a step-by-step instruction like a recipe to solve a problem. And algorithms are used all the time in computer science. So Google uses search algorithms to find what it is that you want to find and give you your answers. And Facebook uses algorithms to decide what updates to show you and in what order. A heuristic, though, is a general problem-solving framework, and you can think of them as mental shortcuts. So if I'm trying to find my friend Sherry in Walmart, rather than walk up and down every aisle, which would be a algorithmic search, I may think, well, I know she needs cat food, and just walk right to the cat food aisle, and that's a heuristic search. Other heuristics that people use are things like working backwards, where you solve the problem by focusing on the end result. So I need to graduate college. What do I need to do that? So I'm going to work backwards from that goal. Or you can break a large goal into a series of smaller steps, and people like that too. You can check off every time you finish one of the steps. A mental set is when people persist in approaching a problem in a way that's worked in the past but does not work now. And the problem is that people don't see simpler solutions. They just keep on solving problems the same way. Functional fixedness is when people cannot perceive an object being used for something other than what it's designed for. So there's a famous story, the Apollo 13 mission, they were going to the moon and they had an air filter that failed. And so everyone was going to die. And so they were able to make a new air filter and make it work from spare plastic bags, tape, and air hoses. And from that, they were able to make a functioning air filter, and everybody survived and came back. They made a movie about it too. An anchoring bias is when you focus on one piece of information when making a decision or solving a problem. So for example, housing prices. Now, when you're selling a house, you should set the price high so that people will argue you down from that higher price, but you've already set an anchor on what the house is worth. The solution, if you're looking to buy a house, is don't ask what the price is when you're going to look at a house. Just go in with no idea what the price is and construct your own evaluation of what you think it should cost. And I've used this in my own life. I had a house I valued at $125,000, and it turned out it was selling for $104,000, and so I bought it the same day. But again, if you're selling your house, set a high price and then have people come down from that price. People think they're getting a bargain. A confirmation bias is the fact that people focus on information that confirms their existing beliefs. Amazing to me, research shows that people do research on cars after they buy their car. They want to have it confirmed to them that they did the right thing in buying the car that they bought. So that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, although that's mixing metaphors considerably. It's like a horseless carriage. A hindsight bias is when you believe an event was predictable even though it really wasn't. And so sometimes this is called Monday morning quarterbacking. Now, what the stormtrooper in the picture there, that's not really hindsight bias. He's saying, those really were the droids I was looking for. But it's a funny picture. A representative bias is when you unintentionally stereotype someone or something. So, for example, you might think that professors read and listen to opera and discuss Nietzsche all the time, and I do. But you might be shocked when you see them playing basketball or softball because you're like, what are you doing? I thought you just read and talk about opera all the time. This is absolutely true, though. I know English professors who don't read for fun. And I've said, how can you do that? I can be an English professor and not read. And one of my colleagues has said, I read at work. That's work. An availability heuristic is when you make a decision based on examples, information, or recent experience that's readily brought to mind. So people tend to buy flood insurance after a flood, and they get scared walking home after watching a movie about serial killers. They weren't worried about getting killed by a serial killer, and then they watch a movie about it, and suddenly it's very available to them that this could happen. It's a good segue into intelligence. Charles Spearman said that there was one general factor which he called G, and that could be measured and compared between people. And actually, Aristotle had a similar view. We can also talk about crystallized and fluid intelligence. Now, crystallized intelligence is acquired knowledge and the ability to retrieve it. And in theory, it grows over your lifetime. Whereas fluid intelligence is your ability to see complex relationships and solve problems. Fluid intelligence peaks at age 25, and then it begins to go down. So it's more difficult to learn. If you're learning a foreign language, it's tougher to learn it at 50 than it is at 20 because of your fluid intelligence. The triarchic theory of intelligence is Robert Sternberg's theory. And this is the idea that intelligence is comprised of three parts: Practical intelligence is street smarts, and it's different from traditional IQ. You could be really smart and have no street smarts. You could be not as high of an IQ and be very street smart. It's basically applying knowledge based on your own experiences. Analytical intelligence is academic problem solving and computation. So basically what we would learn in school. So this is your ability to analyze, evaluate, judge, compare, and contrast. And creative intelligence is inventing or imagining a solution to a problem or situation. So 3 different types of intelligence, hence triarchic. The multiple intelligences theory comes from Howard Gardner, and he says that every person possesses varying amounts of at least 8 intelligences. So, for example, he always says linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence should be listed first because those are the things that are taught in school. But we also have musical intelligence, so some people can play instruments. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which would be things like dance. Spatial intelligence, which would be like your ability to throw a football and be able to have somebody be able to catch it. That would with using their bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Naturalist intelligence is your ability to grow things. And you have both inter and intrapersonal intelligences too. Your ability to basically read other people and know yourself. Emotional intelligence, this is a good segue, is your ability to understand the emotions of yourself and others, which is basically intra and interpersonal intelligences. Show empathy, understand social relationships and cues, and regulate your own emotions. And people who are high in emotional intelligence tend to have well-developed social skills. There's also such a thing as cultural intelligence, and it's also known as cultural competence, and it's how well you relate to the values of a different culture. Creativity is the ability to generate, create, or discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. So creative people typically have intense knowledge about something, work on it for years, look at novel solutions, seek out advice and help of other experts, and take risks. We can talk about divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is thinking outside of the box, and it allows an individual to arrive at unique, multiple solutions to a given problem. Convergent thinking is really thinking inside the box, but it's comfortable inside the box. It's your ability to provide a correct or well-established answer to a solution or problem. Not surprisingly, creativity is usually assessed as a function of people's ability to engage in divergent thinking, to think outside of the box. How do we measure intelligence? Well, in terms of an intelligence quotient, also known as IQ, and that's a score earned on a test designed to measure intelligence. It's often expensive to administer intelligence tests, and they have to be given by a licensed psychologist. Now, these start in the late 1800s with Sir Francis Galton, and he developed the first test of intelligence. He actually believed that intelligence was tied to your perceptual ability. And so this ties back to like being fit for your environment and evolution. And Galton was actually a cousin of Charles Darwin, so that's kind of how he came up with that idea. Early 1900s, Alfred Binet, he developed the first reliable intelligence testing. He was appointed by the government of France to identify children who might be having difficulty in school, and that was so that they would be able to receive more help. Louis Terman was a Stanford professor, and he modified Binet's test by norming and standardizing it, which means that he tested thousands of diverse-aged children so that their range of scores resulted in a bell curve, and he developed what's called the Stanford, that's spelled incorrectly, the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale. Standardization is the manner of administering, scoring, and interpreting results consistently. I need to spell check these things. Norming involves giving a test to a large population so that the data can be collected comparing various groups, such as age groups. So norms are not expectations of what a given group should know, but a demonstration of what the group does know. I'm laughing because I have things that are misspelled, and I'm talking about intelligence. David Wexler was a psychologist who spent part of his career working with World War I veterans, and he basically created the WAIS, which is an adult intelligence test, and he did it by combining intelligence tests that were available at his time. The Flynn effect refers to the observation that each generation has a significantly higher IQ than the last generation. And this is named after James Flynn, who's pictured to the right. And he argued that increased IQ scores don't necessarily mean that younger generations are more intelligent per se. This is a very interesting finding, though, because it's thought that education teaches people how to think abstractly. And scores have improved even on non-math and vocabulary tests. So things like, there's a test called Raven's Progressive Matrices, and all it is it's a completely culturally blind test of pattern matching. That's all you have to do. It's abstract pattern matching. And people keep on doing better on that every generation too. And so to me, it's a very fascinating finding. A bell curve is a graph in the general shape of a bell, and the shape results from intelligence tests tend to follow a bell curve. When it's used in psychological testing, the graph demonstrates a normal distribution of a trait, and in this case, it's intelligence. And the average IQ is a 100. You need to make sure you have a representative sample, and that's a subset of the population that accurately represents the general population. You want them to be representative. You want to be able to, it's really an external validity issue. Standard deviations describe how data sets are dispersed in the population and give context to larger data sets. So in modern IQ testing, one standard deviation is 15 points. So 68% of the population falls between one standard deviation, if you want to look at that chart there. So really between 85 and 115. And 95% of people fall between two standard deviations, so between 70 and 130. 2.2% of the population has an IQ below 70, and that indicates significant cognitive delays, major deficits in adaptive functioning, and difficulty meeting community standards of personal independence and social responsibility. It used to be called mental retardation, but the accepted term now is intellectual disability, and it has 4 subtypes. Mild, which is a full 85% of people with an intellectual disability. Moderate, severe, and profound. Now, some people are considered gifted, and that's if they have an IQ score of 130 or higher, or if they have superior intelligence in a particular area. In 1921, Lewis Terman began a longitudinal study, which means you're studying the same people over, in this case, decades, and he had 1,500 children with IQs over 135. Now, the kids eventually called themselves the termites. Like it was the Terman study, so they're the termites. And there's been a number of books that were written about the findings from this study. But one of the things they found, so prior to Terman's research, there was a theory that was called early ripe, early rot, that very intelligent children would essentially burn out and in their 20s and just become failures. And what Truman found is that the children became well-educated, successful adults who were well-adjusted psychologically. And the results also showed that the children were above average in physical build and attractiveness, and that dispelled an earlier popular notion that intelligent children were essentially weaklings. So what's the source of intelligence? Where does it come from? Well, the Minnesota study of twins reared apart is one of the most well-known twin studies. And the researchers found that identical twins raised together and identical twins raised apart exhibit a higher correlation between their IQ scores than siblings or fraternal twins raised together. So the findings from this study reveal a genetic component to intelligence. However, it's not always possible to isolate how and when high intelligence is passed on to the next generation. And this is very controversial stuff. So one theory is that there's a range of reaction. We've talked about this before. And this is that each person responds to the environment in a unique way based on their genetic makeup. So your genetic potential is a fixed quantity, but whether you reach that full intellectual potential is dependent on the environmental stimulation that you experience. Social structure also plays a part in intelligence, and it varies among ethnic groups and socioeconomic status. And that means ethnic groups within a larger culture. So children growing up in poverty are likely to suffer some deficits. Arthur Jensen, he tested IQ among various groups of students and concluded that IQ is determined by genetics. He also posited, this is incredibly controversial research. Let me make sure that that's completely clear too. He also posited that intelligence is made up of two different abilities. So level 1 is rote memorization, and according to his findings, that's consistent across people in different cultures, and he said across the human race. Level 2 is conceptual and analytical abilities, and he said it's most prevalent among certain groups. And his conclusions don't account for things like culture, socioeconomic status, parenting practices, parents' education, or about 1,000 other variables. And again, the leaps of logic that occur in intelligence testing, again, we're talking, Darwin's cousin thinks it's your ability to hear a whistle. The limits of IQ testing are really revealed when you start getting into these things. That's a picture of Arthur Jensen. To the right, he died in 2012. What about learning disabilities? They're cognitive disorders that affect different areas of cognition, particularly language or reading. And these aren't the same as intellectual disabilities. They're considered to be specific neurological impairments rather than global intellectual or developmental disabilities. And they're often not recognized until a child reaches school age. Interestingly, between 30 and 70% of individuals with ADHD also have some sort of learning disability. Let's finish out by talking about dysgraphia, and that's when you have a learning disability that results in a struggle to write legibly. This difficulty is inconsistent with a person's IQ, and so it could be high or low. And children with dysgraphia may also have problems with their spatial abilities. So accommodations for students with dysgraphia might include being allowed to take an oral exam rather than a paper and pencil test. An individual with dyslexia exhibits an inability to correctly process letters, and it's thought that they have a difficulty in understanding sound letter correspondence. And so as you can imagine, learning to read with dyslexia is challenging and frustrating. And so it can lead to real issues with that. Now, this is less than an ideal segue, but I want to remind you that all of your problems, at least all of your APA style problems, can be solved with my Learn APA Style book. So when you want to learn to write correctly or write right, consult my book and videos on Learn APA Style, which are about writing in psychology and the social sciences. Have a great day, and thanks for listening.